Sometimes a man carries a burden so heavy it bends his back and breaks his heart. Yet he carries it still because love demands nothing less. For 40 years, Whittler Jack has lived alone on his mountain, protecting an ancient tree that everyone thinks is just old timber. The folks down in Pine Hollow call him crazy for keeping people away from it with his sharp words and sharper knife. They don't know that tree has been alive for over 400 years, older than their town, older than their memories. Jack guards it in his wheelchair, whittling wood and watching over something precious. When sickness comes to Pine Hollow and people start dying, the town doctor gives up hope. That's when Jack rolls down from his mountain home and puts his weathered hand on the tree's bark. What happens next changes everything the people thought they knew about the old mountain man and his tree. But what secret has Jack been keeping all these years that could save his town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Pine Hollow like an old man's memories, reluctant to let go of the night. Down in the valley, the town was stirring to life with the familiar sounds of a place that had seen better days, but hadn't given up hope. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, children walked to school with lunch pails swinging, and the aroma of fresh bread drifted from Martha's Bakery on Main Street. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a stranger stood out like a sore thumb, and where secrets were harder to keep than a hen in a fox house. But up on the mountain, past the old mining roads that hadn't seen a cart in 30 years, lived a man who had managed to keep the biggest secret of all. Jack Thornfield, though most folks just called him Whittler Jack, sat on the porch of his cabin as he did every morning, his weathered hands working a piece of pine with the practiced ease of 4 decades. The wood shavings curled away from his knife like tiny prayers, falling to join the countless others that carpeted the ground around his chair. His legs, useless since the cave-in at the Copper Bell mine back in '83, rested still beneath a worn quilt his late wife had stitched with her own loving hands. The cabin itself told the story of a man who had learned to make do. What had started as a temporary shelter while he recovered from his injuries had become a permanent home when he realized he could never leave, not with the tree so close. Every board had been cut and fitted by his own hands, every nail driven with purpose. The structure leaned slightly to the east, as if bowing toward the rising sun, but it was solid as the mountain itself. From his porch, Jack could see the tree through the gap in the forest canopy. It stood perhaps a quarter-mile away, rising above the surrounding pines like a cathedral spire reaching toward heaven. Even from this distance, he could make out the thick trunk that would take 6 grown men holding hands to encircle, and the massive branches that spread like arms embracing the sky. To most eyes, it appeared to be just another old-growth pine, impressive in size but unremarkable in nature. Jack knew better. He had been 17 when his grandfather first brought him to this mountain, back when the old man's eyes still held their fire and his back was still straight. "There's something you need to see, boy," Grandpa Ezra had said, leading him up the winding deer path that Jack now knew by heart. "Something that's been in our family's keeping for longer than you can imagine." That was when Jack first learned about the light. The tree. Grandpa Ezra had always called it simply the tree, as if there were no other worth mentioning, held within its ancient heart a power that defied explanation. During the day it appeared ordinary enough, though careful observers might notice that the bark seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But at night, when the moon was dark and the world was still, the tree would glow with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat, casting gentle rays through the forest that seemed to whisper of older times and deeper truths. The Thornfield men have been guardians for 7 generations. Grandpa Ezra had explained as they stood before the massive trunk. "Your great-great-great-grandfather was the first to settle here, back when this was still Cherokee land. The tribal elders entrusted him with the secret after he helped defend their village from raiders. They called it the heart of the mountain, said it was old when their grandfathers were young. Jack had reached out to touch the bark, and even in the daylight, he had felt the warmth radiating from within. It was like placing his hand against the chest of a sleeping giant. "What does it do?" young Jack had asked. "Heals," the old man had said simply. "But the healing comes with a price. Every time the tree shares its gift, it takes something from the guardian. Your great-great-great-grandfather lived to be 97, but his hair went white the first time he called upon the light. Your great-great-grandfather saved a dozen children from the fever that swept through the territory in 1847, but he was never quite the same afterward. Like part of his soul stayed behind in the tree. Now, 40 years later, Jack understood exactly what his grandfather had meant. The tree didn't just heal bodies. It healed hearts, minds, and spirits. But every miracle came at a cost to the one who stood as guardian. The old Cherokee had known this, had built their warnings into the very fiber of the trust they had placed in the Thornfield family. "Power like this," Grandpa Ezra had said, "it attracts the wrong kind of attention. Government men, fortune hunters, folks who'd want to cut it down and haul it off to some laboratory. That's why we guard it. That's why we keep the secret." Jack set down his whittling and wheeled his chair to the edge of the porch. His daily ritual wasn't complete without his morning check on the tree. Through the field glasses that hung around his neck, he could see the faint network of symbols carved into the bark, protective markings that he and his forefathers had cut over the generations. Each symbol told a story, marked a healing, or served as a ward against those who might approach with harmful intent. The symbols were his heritage, but they were also his burden. Every time someone in the valley fell seriously ill, every time a child developed a fever that wouldn't break, or an elder began to fade, Jack felt the pull. The tree called to him, whispered that he could help, that he could save them. But the cost, the terrible cost of using such power, kept him rooted to his mountain, watching from afar while good people suffered. He had learned long ago that he couldn't save everyone. The few times he had brought people to the tree over the years, always in secret, always at night, had taken pieces of him that he could never get back. His hair had gone from brown to silver to white. Lines had deepened around his eyes like canyons, carved by decades of difficult choices. And somewhere deep inside, in a place he tried not to examine too closely, he felt hollow, as if the light had slowly been consuming him from within. The sound of an approaching motor broke his morning reverie. Jack lowered his field glasses and listened as the engine grew closer, recognizing the distinctive wheeze of Doc Patterson's old truck. The vehicle came into view around the bend, kicking up dust as it navigated the rough mountain road that Jack maintained just well enough to discourage casual visitors. Doc Patterson climbed out of the truck with the careful movements of a man whose joints had begun to betray him. At 72, he was one of the few people in Pine Hollow who remembered when Jack had been young and whole before the mining accident had changed everything. He was also one of the even fewer people who had any idea about what Jack really guarded up here on the mountain. "Morning." "Jack," Doc called, retrieving his medical bag from the truck bed. "Morning. Doc, what brings you up my way today?" The older man's face was grave as he approached the porch. "Need to talk to you about something that's got me worried. Mind if I sit a spell?" Jack gestured to the wooden chair beside his own, the one he had built for visitors who rarely came. Doc Patterson lowered himself onto it with a soft grunt, setting his bag on the porch boards between them. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." Jack offered. "Much obliged." Doc accepted the mug that Jack poured from the pot he kept on a small table beside his chair. The coffee was strong and black, the kind that could wake the dead or strip paint. Depending on your point of view, they sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two old men who had seen enough of life to appreciate the quiet moments. Below them, the valley spread out like a quilt, with Pine Hollow nestled in its center like a sleeping child. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Jack could make out the tiny figures of people going about their daily routines, unaware of the conversation taking place on the mountain above. "Jack," Doc finally said, "we've got ourselves a situation down in town. Something I've never seen before, and that's saying something after 50 years of practicing medicine." Jack set down his coffee mug, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. What kind of situation? Started about a week ago with the Morrison boy. You remember little Tommy, Sarah's youngest, came down with what looked like the flu. High fever, chills, aches, standard stuff. But then it spread, fast, too fast for any flu I've ever seen. How many? 17 so far, and the number's climbing every day. Age doesn't seem to matter. I've got patients from 8 years old to 80. The symptoms are the same across the board. Fever that spikes to dangerous levels, weakness that leaves them barely able to stand, and then, Doc paused, rubbing his forehead. Then they just start fading, like something inside them is being drained away. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Fading how? Their eyes lose focus first. Then they stop responding to voices, stop eating. It's like they're disappearing piece by piece while their bodies are still breathing. They've tried everything in my medical arsenal, Jack. Antibiotics, antivirals, even sent samples to the state lab in Billings. Nothing. The lab says they can't identify any infectious agent, bacterial or viral. The two men sat in silence again, but this time it was heavy, with unspoken implications. Doc Patterson was the only person in Pine Hollow who knew about Jack's family history, the only one who had pieced together enough of the truth to understand what resources might be available on this mountain. He had been the one to treat Jack after the mining accident, had seen things during those long recovery months that a man of science wasn't supposed to believe. How long do they have? Jack asked quietly. At the rate they're declining, I'd say days, maybe a week for the stronger ones. Jack, I've never asked this of you before, and I know what it means, but I know what you're asking, Doc. Those are good people down there. Families with children. Sarah Morrison hasn't left her boy's bedside in 3 days. The Hendersons have 2 kids sick, and their youngest is only 8 years old. Jack closed his eyes and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a yoke he had carried for 4 decades. The tree was calling to him, its ancient voice whispering through the morning air, reminding him of the power that waited in its heartwood and the healing that could flow from its roots. But the cost. Always the cost. Doc, you know what happened the last time. I know. But that was different. Mrs. Calloway was already dying when you helped her, and she lived another 15 good years. This is 17 people, Jack. 17 souls who still have life left to live. Jack opened his eyes and stared out at the tree, its massive form swaying gently in the morning breeze. Somewhere in its ancient rings lay the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the patient endurance of something that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human generations. The Cherokee had called it the heart of the mountain, but Jack had always thought of it as something even more fundamental, the soul of the earth itself, concentrated into living wood and flowing sap. Give me until sunset, Jack said finally. I need to think about this, to prepare if I'm going to do what I think you're asking. Doc Patterson nodded and rose from his chair, his medical bag in hand. Jack, I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. I know. Doc, I know. After the truck disappeared back down the mountain road, Jack sat alone with his thoughts and his coffee, watching the trees sway in the distance. The decision was already made, had been made the moment Doc Patterson spoke the first child's name. Jack had known this day would come eventually, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. He wheeled his chair inside the cabin and began his preparations. There were rituals to observe, ceremonies that his grandfather had taught him and his grandfather's grandfather had learned from the Cherokee elders. The tree would answer when called. But respect had to be shown, prices had to be acknowledged, and guardians had to be willing to pay whatever cost the healing demanded. As the sun climbed higher over Pine Hollow, Jack Thornfield prepared to keep a promise that had been made 7 generations ago, knowing that by sunset, either 17 people would be saved, or the mountain would need a new guardian. The tree waited patient as stone, old as time, and hungry for the light that only sacrifice could provide. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Jack heard the sound that would change everything. The desperate roar of an engine being pushed far beyond its limits, followed by the screech of brakes and the slam of truck doors. He had been sitting in contemplation for hours, his whittling knife idle in his lap, when Doc Patterson's truck came careening back up the mountain road, like the devil himself was giving chase. This time, Doc wasn't alone. Sarah Morrison climbed out of the passenger side, her face streaked with tears, and her clothes wrinkled from days of keeping vigil at her son's bedside. Behind her came Pete Henderson, a man whose hands could fix any engine, but who now looked helpless as a child, his own children lying sick in the valley below. "Jack!" Doc called out, his voice cracking with urgency. "It's gotten worse. Much worse." Sarah Morrison stepped forward, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing with a mother's fierce determination. "Mr. Thornfield, I know folks say you're just a crazy old mountain man, but Doc Patterson says maybe you can help. My boy Tommy is dying, and I'll believe in anything if it means saving him." The desperation in her voice hit Jack like a physical blow. He had watched this woman grow up in Pine Hollow, had seen her graduate from the little schoolhouse, marry young Billy Morrison, and raise 3 children, with the quiet strength that seemed to run in the mountain women. Now she stood before him, stripped of everything except hope. How much worse? Jack asked Doc, though he dreaded the answer. 3 more cases since this morning, including the preacher's wife. And the ones who've had it longest. They're not just fading anymore, Jack. They're dying. Really dying. I lost Mrs. Chen an hour ago. The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mrs. Chen had run the general store for 30 years, had never missed a church service, and had made the best apple pie in 3 counties. She had been as much a fixture of Pine Hollow as the mountains themselves. "Doc tried everything," Pete Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every medicine, every treatment. Nothing's working. My little girl, Mary, she's only 8 years old, and this morning she couldn't even recognize me." His voice broke. "She looked right through me like I was a stranger." Jack gripped the wheels of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. The tree was calling to him now, its ancient voice rising above the wind in the pines, promising healing, offering salvation. But with that promise came the echo of his grandfather's warnings and the memory of every previous guardian who had paid the price for wielding such power. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what exactly did Doc tell you about me?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He said your family's been living up here for generations, keeping watch over something special. Something that might be able to help when regular medicine can't." She paused, studying his face. "He said you've helped people before, but that it costs you something." "I don't care what it costs, Mr. Thornfield. I'll pay any price if you can save my boy." "It doesn't work that way," Jack said gently. "The price isn't yours to pay." A new voice cut through the conversation, young and frightened, but trying to sound brave. "Grandpa Jack?" They all turned to see a small figure emerging from the truck bed where she had apparently been hiding. Lucy Henderson, Pete's youngest daughter, was supposed to be in the hospital with her sister, but somehow she had managed to slip away and follow the adults up the mountain. At 10 years old, she had always been too clever for her own good. Lucy. Pete started toward her, but she dodged around him and wheeled her way directly to Jack's chair. "Grandpa Jack," she said again, using the name she had called him since she was old enough to talk. Like many of the Valley children, she had adopted him as an honorary relative, and Jack had always had a soft spot for her quick mind and fearless spirit. "Mary's really sick, and Mama's crying all the time, and the doctor can't fix her." "But you can, can't you? You live up here with the magic tree." The adults froze. Children had a way of cutting through pretense and speaking truths that adults spent years learning to hide. "Lucy, honey," Pete said carefully, "where did you hear about a magic tree?" "Everyone knows," she said matter-of-factly. "All the kids talk about it. We know Grandpa Jack lives up here protecting something special, and that's why he never comes down to town anymore. Tommy Morrison told me his dad said the old Cherokee used to come up here for healing ceremonies, back before there was even a town." Jack found himself smiling, despite the gravity of the situation. "And what else do the children say about this magic tree?" "And that it glows at night sometimes, and that it can make sick people better, but only if they really need it, and only if someone who loves them asks the tree really, really nicely." Lucy's face grew serious. "I love Mary really, really much, Grandpa Jack. More than ice cream and Christmas and my favorite book all put together." The innocence and faith in her voice broke something loose in Jack's chest. Here was a child who believed in magic, not because she was naive, but because she understood instinctively what adults often forgot, that love itself was magical, and that sometimes the world held wonders that science couldn't explain. "Doc," Jack said, turning to the older man, "how long before we lose more of them?" "Hours, maybe. Definitely by morning. The Henderson boy isn't responding at all anymore, and Sarah's Tommy has stopped drinking water." Jack looked at each of them in turn. Doc Patterson, with his lifetime of medical knowledge rendered useless. Pete Henderson, trying to hold himself together for his family's sake. Sarah Morrison, with her mother's heart breaking in real time. And little Lucy Henderson, whose faith burned brighter than the afternoon sun. The decision crystallized in his mind, like ice forming on a winter pond. Some choices weren't really choices at all. "Sarah, Pete, I need you to understand something," Jack said, his voice taking on the formal tone his grandfather had used during the most serious conversations. "What I'm about to tell you has been a family secret for 7 generations. My people have been guardians of something up here on this mountain since before Pine Hollow existed, something the Cherokee entrusted to us when they could no longer protect it themselves." He gestured toward the gap in the trees, where the tree was visible in the distance. "That's not just any tree out there. It's over 400 years old, and it holds a power that can heal any sickness, mend any injury, cure any ailment. But that power comes with a price, and the price is always paid by the guardian." "What kind of price?" Pete asked. "Years of life. Pieces of your soul. The first time my great-great-great-grandfather used the tree's power, his hair went white overnight. My grandfather aged a decade in a single healing. Every time the tree shares its gift, it takes something from the one who asks." Sarah Morrison stepped closer to his chair. "And you're willing to pay that price for our children?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the tree that had been both his heritage and his burden for 40 years. "My grandfather told me once that a guardian's job isn't to hoard power, but to use it wisely. I've been guarding this secret for 4 decades, and in all that time, I've only used the tree's healing a handful of times. I told myself I was being responsible, protecting the power for when it was truly needed." He turned his wheelchair to face them fully. "But watching good people suffer while I sit on this mountain, that's not guardianship. That's cowardice." "Grandpa Jack," Lucy said softly, "does it hurt when the tree takes the price?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "I don't know, sweetheart. But even if it does, some things are worth hurting for." Doc Patterson had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Jack, what do you need from us?" "I need you to go back to town and gather everyone who's sick. Bring them here before sunset. All of them. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Heal everyone at once, instead of drawing it out." "That's a lot of people to move," Pete said. "Some of them can barely stand. Use whatever vehicles you can find. I'll make sure the road is clear all the way to the tree." Jack looked at each of them again. "But I need you to understand, after tonight things are going to be different. The secret's going to be out, and there's no putting it back. People are going to know about the tree, and that kind of knowledge has a way of attracting attention we might not want." Sarah Morrison reached out and took Jack's weathered hand in both of hers. "Mr. Thornfield, I don't care who finds out or what comes after. If you can save our children, our friends, our neighbors, then whatever happens next, we'll face it together." As the 3 adults and 1 brave little girl climbed back into Doc Patterson's truck, Jack sat alone on his porch and watched the shadows lengthen across the valley. In a few hours, he would wheel himself to the tree for what might be the last time as its guardian. He would place his hands on the ancient bark, speak the words his grandfather had taught him, and ask for a miracle that would save 17 lives. The cost would be his to pay, just as it had been for 7 generations of Thornfield men before him. But as he thought about Tommy Morrison lying pale and still in his mother's arms, about little Mary Henderson who couldn't recognize her own father, about Mrs. Chen, who had already lost her battle. Jack knew there was no choice to be made. Some burdens were too heavy for one man to carry, but some burdens were too important to put down. The tree waited in the distance, patient as time itself, ready to trade miracles for whatever price the healing would demand. The sun hung lower in the western sky as Jack wheeled himself into his cabin to prepare for what lay ahead. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the wooden box on the mantelpiece, not from fear, but from the weight of anticipation. Inside the box, wrapped in soft deerskin that had yellowed with age, lay the ceremonial items that had been passed down through 7 generations of Thornfield guardians. The eagle feather came first, its tip stained dark with the blood of previous ceremonies. Then the small clay bowl, no bigger than a child's cupped hands, that his great-great-great-grandfather had fired himself using clay from the base of the tree. Finally, the sacred knife, different from his whittling blade, whose handle was carved from a branch that had fallen naturally from the tree during a lightning storm over a century ago. Jack had used these items only 3 times in 40 years. Each occasion had been seared into his memory with the clarity that comes from witnessing the impossible. The first time was when he was 25, barely 8 years into his guardianship. A traveling salesman had been thrown from his horse near the mountain road, his leg broken so badly that Doc Patterson, younger then but no less skilled, had spoken quietly about amputation. Jack's grandfather had passed away just 2 years before, taking with him the last of the old teachings. But he had made sure Jack understood the weight of what he carried. That night, under a moonless sky, Jack had brought the salesman to the tree. The man had been delirious with pain and fever, barely conscious as Jack performed the ancient ritual. When the tree's light began to flow, first as a gentle glow beneath the bark, then as streams of golden radiance that seemed to pour from the very roots, the salesman's leg had mended itself before Jack's eyes. Bone had knitted, flesh had healed, and by morning the man was walking normally, but Jack had paid the price. His thick brown hair had developed its first streaks of silver overnight, and for weeks afterward he had felt hollow inside, as if part of his essence had been drawn into the tree's ancient heartwood. The second time was 15 years later, when little Emma Calloway had fallen through the ice on Miller's Pond. They had pulled her out blue and lifeless, and Doc Patterson had shaken his head sadly as he covered the child's face with a blanket. But her grandmother, old Martha Calloway, had grabbed Jack's sleeve with surprising strength. "I know what you guard up there," she had whispered. "My grandmother was Cherokee, and she told me stories about the heart of the mountain. Please, Jack, she's only 6 years old." That healing had taken even more from him. The silver in his hair had spread. Lines had appeared around his eyes, and for months afterward he had dreams of light flowing out of him like water from a broken vessel. But Emma Calloway had taken her first breath as the tree's golden radiance surrounded her small form, and she had grown up to become the valley's schoolteacher. The third time had been just 5 years ago, when old Pete Morrison, Sarah's father-in-law, had been diagnosed with the wasting sickness that ate at a man from the inside. Pete had been a good friend, one of the few people who had never treated Jack differently after his accident. When the sickness had progressed beyond what any medicine could touch, Jack had made the journey to the tree once more. That healing had cost him the most yet. His hair had gone completely white, and something fundamental had shifted inside him. He had felt older afterward, not just in years, but in the bone-deep way that spoke of borrowed time. The tree had saved Pete Morrison's life, giving him 5 good years with his family. But Jack had felt the weight of those years settling on his own shoulders. Now, as he arranged the ceremonial items in their proper order, Jack wondered what price 17 healings would demand. Would he survive it? Would there be enough of him left afterward to continue as guardian? These were questions without answers. Mysteries that would only be resolved when the tree's ancient power flowed through him once again. A sound from outside drew his attention, the distant rumble of engines echoing up from the valley. Through his window, he could see a convoy of vehicles beginning the winding climb up the mountain road. Doc Patterson's truck led the way, followed by the Henderson family's station wagon. Then Pastor William's van, and behind them, what looked like half the vehicles in Pine Hollow. Word had spread quickly through the small town, as word always did. The sick were being gathered, carried by family members who clung to hope like drowning men clutching driftwood. Jack could imagine the scene. Children wrapped in blankets, elderly folks propped up with pillows. Teenagers who had been vibrant just days ago, now pale and listless in the arms of their parents. As the convoy drew closer, Jack completed his preparations. He placed the ceremonial items in a canvas bag that hung from his wheelchair, then checked the special path he had carved years ago, a route wide enough for his chair that led directly from his cabin to the tree. The path wound through the forest like a prayer made visible, marked at intervals with the protective symbols that his ancestors had taught him to carve. The first vehicle reached his cabin just as the sun touched the highest peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Doc Patterson climbed out of his truck, his face drawn with exhaustion, and moved to help unload his passenger, young Tommy Morrison. Wrapped in a quilt and barely conscious in his mother's arms. "Jack!" Sarah Morrison called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. "He's gotten worse. I don't think he even knows I'm here anymore." More vehicles arrived in quick succession, and Jack's quiet mountain sanctuary was suddenly filled with the sounds of a community in crisis. Pete Henderson carried his daughter Mary, the little girl's arms hanging limp as she drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Pastor Williams emerged from his van, supporting his wife, a woman who had been the backbone of every church function for 20 years, and now could barely stand on her own. Others followed, the young schoolteacher who had inspired a generation of children, the mechanic whose gentle hands could coax life from the most stubborn engine, the elderly woman who had run the post office since before most people could remember. 17 souls in various stages of the mysterious ailment that was slowly draining them of life. Jack wheeled his chair to the edge of his porch and surveyed the gathering crowd. These were his people, the community that had grown up around the base of his mountain. Some had known him since childhood, others had only heard stories about the hermit who lived among the pines. But all of them had come to him in their darkest hour, trusting in something they didn't fully understand because conventional medicine had failed them. "Folks," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I know you're scared. I know this seems impossible. But I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." The crowd quieted, faces turning toward him with expressions that mixed desperation and hope in equal measure. "My family has been keeping a secret for 7 generations, Jack continued. "Up there, about a quarter-mile into the trees, stands something that the Cherokee called the heart of the mountain. It's older than our town, older than our state, and it holds a power that can heal any sickness." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some skeptical, others wondering, a few nodding as if pieces of long-held suspicions were finally falling into place. "But," Jack raised his voice, "this power comes with a price. Not for you, not for your loved ones, but for the one who asks the tree to share its gift. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what I'm risking, and because after tonight, the secret will be out. There's no going back from what we're about to do." A voice from the crowd spoke up, old Henry Walsh, whose grandson was among the sick. "Jack, son, what kind of price are we talking about?" Jack met the old man's eyes steadily. "Years of my life, maybe all of them. I don't know what 17 healings will cost, but I'm willing to pay it." The crowd fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over them like evening mist. These were mountain people, raised on hard truths and practical realities. They understood that miracles didn't come free, that everything worthwhile in life required sacrifice. "Why?" Sarah Morrison asked, stepping closer to his chair. "Why would you do this for us?" Jack looked out over the faces gathered in his clearing, young and old, familiar and distant, but all of them part of the community that had been his neighbors for 40 years. "Because that's what guardians do. We guard. And sometimes the best way to guard something is to use it. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Jack began the slow journey toward the tree. Behind him, the procession formed, families carrying their sick, friends supporting each other, an entire community united in hope and need. The ancient pine waited in the darkness ahead, patient as always, ready to trade miracles for whatever price the healing would demand. The procession moved through the forest like a river of hope flowing uphill. Jack led the way in his wheelchair, following the familiar path that had been worn smooth by decades of his solitary journeys. Behind him, the sounds of the community filled the usually silent woods, hushed voices offering comfort. The soft shuffle of careful footsteps and the occasional whispered prayer carried on the evening breeze. The path wound between ancient pines, whose trunks rose like cathedral pillars into the darkening sky. Jack had carved this route himself over the years, making it wide enough for his chair, while still maintaining the reverent atmosphere that such a journey required. Every 50 yards, one of his protective symbols marked a tree, circles and spirals, arrows and crosses, each one carved with careful precision and filled with a mixture of pine sap and clay from the tree's base. Lucy Henderson walked beside his chair, her small hand resting on the armrest as she helped guide him over the rougher patches. Despite her parents' protests, she had insisted on making the journey, declaring with 10-year-old certainty that Mary needed her sister close by. Now she chatted quietly with Jack, her innocent questions providing a welcome distraction from the weight of what lay ahead. "Grandpa Jack, how did your great-great-great-grandfather know the tree was special?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Cherokee told him," Jack replied, his hands steady on the wheels despite the growing fatigue in his arms. "They said their medicine men had been coming to this tree for generations, that it had always been a place where the spirit world touched our world. Do you think the spirits are still here?" Jack glanced up at the canopy above them, where the last traces of daylight filtered through the pine needles like fragments of stained glass. "I think this whole mountain is full of spirits, sweetheart. Good ones who watch over people like us." Behind them, Doc Patterson was explaining to those who could listen about what they might see. "The tree will glow," he said quietly to Pastor Williams, who was supporting his wife as she walked. "I've seen it before, years ago when Jack helped old Pete Morrison. It starts as just a shimmer in the bark, then spreads until the whole tree looks like it's lit from within." Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "In seminary, they taught us that God works through many vessels. I've always believed there were wonders in this world that went beyond our understanding." The path began to climb more steeply as they approached the tree's grove. Jack could feel it calling to him now, a warm presence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The sensation had grown stronger over the years, as if 4 decades of guardianship had created a bond that went deeper than mere proximity. Sarah Morrison struggled with Tommy's weight as the incline increased. Her son had grown heavier as he grew sicker, his body becoming a dead weight that spoke of how far the mysterious illness had progressed. Pete Henderson noticed her difficulty and moved to help, cradling the boy so Sarah could catch her breath. "How much further?" she asked, her voice tight with exhaustion and worry. "Just around this next bend," Jack replied. "The grove opens up about 100 yards ahead." As they rounded the curve in the path, the tree came into view, and several people in the procession drew sharp breaths of surprise. Even in the gathering darkness, its massive presence was unmistakable. The trunk rose straight and true, disappearing into the canopy overhead, while the lower branches spread outward like arms reaching to embrace the entire grove. In the fading light, the bark seemed to shimmer with an inner radiance that suggested depths beyond what the eye could see. "My God," whispered Mrs. Patterson, Doc's wife, who had insisted on coming despite her own advancing years. "It's beautiful." The grove itself was a natural cathedral, a circular clearing surrounded by smaller pines that seemed to bow respectfully toward their ancient patriarch. The ground was carpeted with centuries of fallen needles, creating a soft, almost cushioned surface that muffled footsteps and absorbed sound. At the base of the great tree, the earth was bare in a perfect circle, as if nothing else dared to grow too close to such concentrated power. Jack wheeled his chair to the edge of this circle and stopped. The tree loomed above them all, its presence both comforting and overwhelming. He could feel the power within it stirring, responding to the need that had brought so many people to this sacred place. "Everyone needs to form a circle around the tree," Jack instructed, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed grove. "Those who are sick should be placed as close to the trunk as possible. Family members can stay close, but leave room for the light to flow." The community arranged itself with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to work together through generations of mountain living. The sick were gently placed on blankets at the tree's base, Tommy Morrison and Mary Henderson side by side, the pastor's wife leaning against the massive trunk, the elderly postal worker resting with her head pillowed on her daughter's lap. Jack reached into the canvas bag hanging from his wheelchair and withdrew the ceremonial items one by one. The eagle feather caught what little light remained, its dark tip seeming to absorb the surrounding shadows. The clay bowl felt warm in his hands, as if it had been sitting by a fire. The sacred knife hummed with an energy that seemed to resonate with the tree itself. "What happens now?" asked Henry Walsh, his voice hoarse with emotion as he looked down at his sick grandson. "Now I do what my family has done for 7 generations, Jack replied. He wheeled his chair closer to the tree, close enough to touch the bark with his outstretched hand. "I ask for a miracle, and I pay whatever price is demanded." The moment his palm made contact with the ancient bark, Jack felt the tree's consciousness stir. It was vast and patient, older than memory, deeper than understanding. Within its rings lay the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the patient endurance of something that had weathered countless storms and seasons. It knew him, recognized him as the latest in a long line of guardians who had tended and protected and occasionally called upon its power. But there was something else in that ancient awareness, a sense of ending, of cycles completing themselves. The tree had been waiting for this moment, this final great healing that would mark the conclusion of something that had begun long before Jack was born. With trembling hands, he began the ceremony his grandfather had taught him. First, he used the sacred knife to make a small cut in his palm, letting 3 drops of blood fall into the clay bowl. Then he touched the eagle feather to his lips and spoke the words that had been passed down through generations of Thornfield men. "Heart of the mountain, ancient guardian, we come to you in our time of need. These people are your people, as I am your guardian. I ask you to share your gift of healing, and I offer myself to pay whatever price you demand." The tree's response was immediate and overwhelming. Light began to flow beneath the bark, starting as a gentle glow and quickly building to a radiance that filled the grove with golden illumination. The sick began to stir as the healing energy reached them, but Jack barely noticed. The price was already being collected, and it was more than he had ever imagined. The light that flowed from the tree was unlike anything the gathered community had ever witnessed. It started as veins of gold threading through the bark, then spread outward like liquid fire, illuminating every groove and ridge in the ancient trunk. The radiance grew brighter, casting dancing shadows among the surrounding pines and bathing the entire grove in a warm, ethereal glow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a great heartbeat. Jack felt the power flowing through him, using his body as a conduit between the tree's ancient consciousness and the 17 souls who lay dying at its base. But this wasn't like the gentle healings he had facilitated before. This was a torrent, a rushing river of energy that threatened to sweep away everything he was and leave only an empty shell behind. The first shock came as a stabbing pain in his chest, as if someone had driven a red-hot poker through his heart. Jack gasped, his weathered hands gripping the wheels of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. The tree was drawing not just years from his life, but pieces of his very essence, memories, experiences, the accumulated wisdom of 4 decades spent in solitary guardianship. "Jack!" Doc Patterson started toward him, but Jack held up a trembling hand. Don't "Don't break the circle," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "It has to finish." The healing light reached the first of the sick, little Mary Henderson, and the change was immediate and miraculous. Color returned to her pale cheeks, her breathing deepened and steadied, and her eyes fluttered open with awareness that had been absent for days. But even as the child began to stir, Jack felt a decade of his life flow into the tree's heartwood. His hair, already white from previous healings, began to thin and recede. The lines around his eyes deepened into canyons, and his hands, strong despite his disability, began to show the prominent veins and age spots of advanced years. But still the healing continued, the tree's power flowing through him to reach Tommy Morrison, then the pastor's wife, then each of the other sick in turn. Sarah Morrison cried out in joy as her son opened his eyes and spoke her name for the first time in days. "Mama?" Tommy said weakly, his voice carrying clearly through the golden-lit grove. "What happened? Where are we?" But her joy turned to concern as she looked at Jack. The mountain man who had been weathered but vital just minutes before was aging before their eyes. His broad shoulders had begun to stoop, his strong jaw had softened, and his eyes, while still alert, had taken on the clouded appearance of extreme old age. "Something's wrong," Pete Henderson said, his own relief at Mary's recovery tempered by what he was witnessing. "This is taking too much from him." Doc Patterson knelt beside Jack's wheelchair, checking his pulse with professional concern. "His heart rate's irregular, and his breathing is becoming labored. Jack, I think you need to stop this." "Can't stop," Jack whispered, his voice already growing weaker. "Not until they're all healed. That's the bargain, all or nothing." The tree seemed to sense his determination, and the flow of power intensified. One by one, the sick began to recover. Teenagers who had been fading away sat up and looked around in wonder. Elderly folks who had been barely breathing suddenly drew deep, clear breaths. And children who had been lost in fever dreams began to recognize their families. But with each healing, Jack paid a steeper price. His spine curved further, his breathing became more labored, and something vital seemed to be draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel. The tree was taking not just his remaining years, but reaching backward through his life, claiming experiences and memories as payment for the miracles it was providing. Lucy Henderson, who had been watching the healing with wide-eyed wonder, suddenly noticed what was happening to Jack. "Grandpa Jack!" she cried, breaking away from her parents to run to his side. "You're getting too old. You need to stop." Jack managed a weak smile as he looked down at the brave little girl. "It's okay, sweetheart. This is what guardians do. But what if the tree takes all of you?" The question hit him with startling clarity. What if the tree did take all of him? What would happen to these people? To this community that had finally learned the secret that had been kept for 7 generations? Who would guard the tree when he was gone? As if in response to his thoughts, the tree's consciousness touched his mind directly, and Jack suddenly understood what had been hidden from him all these years. The Cherokee hadn't just entrusted the Thornfield family with guarding the tree. They had been preparing for this moment. This final great healing that would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. The tree had been waiting, growing stronger over the centuries, accumulating power for this single act of mass healing. But such a healing required a guardian willing to give everything, to sacrifice not just years of life, but life itself, to save an entire community. 7 generations of Thornfield men had been leading up to this moment, each one adding their knowledge and dedication to prepare for what Jack was now doing. But there was more. As the healing neared completion, Jack felt the tree offering him a choice, a way to survive the process, but only by sharing the burden with others. The secret that had been kept by one family for generations could be entrusted to the entire community. Instead of one guardian bearing the full weight of protecting such power, many could share the responsibility. "Listen to me," Jack called out, his voice barely audible above the rushing sound of the tree's power. "The healing's almost done, but something's changing. The old way, one guardian, one family keeping the secret, it's ending tonight. The golden light from the tree began to shift, no longer flowing solely through Jack, but reaching out to touch each person in the circle. Men, women, and children found themselves briefly connected to the ancient consciousness, understanding in an instant what it meant to be responsible for such power. "The tree is choosing new guardians," Jack continued, his words coming in short gasps. "Not just one, but all of you. You'll share the responsibility, share the burden. And you'll need to, because after tonight the secret won't be secret anymore." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his wife now fully healed and standing beside him. "What do you mean?" Jack gestured weakly toward the valley below, where lights twinkled in the windows of Pine Hollow. 17 people were dying, and 17 people were healed by what folks will call a miracle. Word will spread. Scientists will come, government people, reporters, fortune hunters. The tree will need protection from all of them. The last of the sick, old Henry Walsh's grandson, opened his eyes and smiled at his grandfather. The healing was complete. 17 lives had been saved, 17 families had been reunited with their loved ones, and 17 miracles had been witnessed by an entire community. But as the tree's golden light began to fade, Jack slumped forward in his wheelchair, aged beyond his years and barely clinging to consciousness. The price had been paid in full, but whether he would survive to see the dawn remained an open question. The grove fell into profound silence as the tree's golden radiance faded to a gentle shimmer and then disappeared entirely. Where moments before there had been the rushing sound of ancient power flowing like a river, now there was only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the soft breathing of 17 people who had been saved from death's door. Jack remained slumped in his wheelchair, his transformed appearance shocking to those who had known him. The strong mountain man who had greeted them at his cabin now looked like he had aged 50 years in as many minutes. His white hair had thinned to wispy strands. His once powerful shoulders had curved with the weight of extreme age, and his hands trembled with the palsy that comes to those who have lived far beyond their allotted time. Doc Patterson was the first to break the silence, moving to Jack's side with his medical bag. "Let me check his vitals," he said quietly, though his voice carried clearly in the hushed grove. "I'm still here, Doc," Jack whispered, his voice now reedy and thin, but still carrying the gentle authority that had marked him for 40 years. "Just a little worse for wear. Jack, what you've done tonight," Sarah Morrison began, still cradling Tommy, who was now alert and asking for water. "What we've all done," Jack corrected her gently. "You felt it, didn't you? When the light touched each of you, the tree didn't just heal your loved ones, it made you part of something larger. Indeed, each person in the circle had experienced that moment of connection, when the ancient consciousness had briefly touched their minds and shown them glimpses of the responsibility that came with knowing such power existed. They had felt the weight of centuries, the patient endurance of something that had watched over this mountain since before their ancestors had ever dreamed of crossing the ocean. Pete Henderson helped his daughter Mary to her feet, marveling at the strength that had returned to her small frame. "I felt it," he said slowly, "like something was asking if we were willing to help protect this place." "And what was your answer?" Jack asked. Pete looked around the grove, taking in the massive tree that stood silent now but somehow still watchful, then at the faces of his neighbors who had shared this impossible experience. "I think we all gave the same answer." Little Lucy Henderson tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, does this mean we're all going to be guardians like Grandpa Jack?" "It means," Jack said, managing a weak smile for the brave girl who had insisted on making this journey, "that the old way of doing things is over. For 7 generations, one family carried this burden alone. But the tree has chosen differently. It's chosen all of you." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his arm around his wife, who was still marveling at her complete recovery. "Jack, how do we even begin to understand what that means?" "The same way my great-great-great-grandfather did," Jack replied. "One day at a time, with respect for what you're protecting and wisdom about when to use it." He paused, his breathing labored. "But there's something else you need to know. What happened here tonight, 17 people healed simultaneously, it's never been done before. The Cherokee legends spoke of such a healing, but they called it the Great Awakening, and they said it would mark the end of the time of secrecy. Doc Patterson frowned as he checked Jack's pulse. What do you mean, the end of secrecy? Think about it, Doc. 17 people were dying of something you couldn't identify or treat. Now they're all completely healthy. How long before someone starts asking questions? How long before word spreads beyond Pine Hollow? The implications of Jack's words began to sink in among the gathered community. In their joy at seeing their loved ones healed, they hadn't fully considered what would happen when they returned to town. How could they explain Tommy Morrison's sudden recovery, or Mary Henderson's return to perfect health, or the pastor's wife standing strong when she had been at death's door just hours ago? We could say it was a new treatment, suggested Mrs. Patterson. Though her voice lacked conviction, 17 people don't recover from an unknown illness overnight because of any treatment modern medicine has to offer. Doc Patterson said grimly. The state health department will want to investigate. Medical researchers will come, and when they can't find any trace of whatever caused the sickness, or any evidence of how it was cured, they'll start looking for other explanations. Henry Walsh, cradling his grandson, who was now sitting up and asking for something to eat, shook his head. So what are you saying? That we can't go home? You can go home, Jack said quietly. But you need to be prepared for what comes next. Within a week, maybe less, there will be people in Pine Hollow asking questions. Government officials, medical researchers, reporters looking for a story. Some of them will be harmless, curious about what they'll call a medical miracle. Others, he paused, remembering his grandfather's warnings about those who would exploit such power. Others will come with different intentions. Sarah Morrison looked around the grove with new understanding. They'll want to find this place. They'll want to study the tree, take samples, maybe even try to cut it down and haul it away to some laboratory. Which is why the tree chose all of you to be guardians, Jack continued. One old man in a wheelchair couldn't stand against what's coming, but a whole community working together might be able to protect this place. The weight of responsibility was settling over them like a heavy blanket. These were ordinary people, storekeepers and mechanics, teachers and farmers who had come to the mountains seeking healing for their loved ones. They hadn't expected to become guardians of an ancient secret, protectors of something that governments and corporations would kill to possess. How do we even begin? Asked the schoolteacher, Miss Evans, who had been among those healed. Oh, what did your family do to keep this secret for so long? Jack reached into the canvas bag still hanging from his wheelchair and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Everything we learned, every encounter with outsiders, every protective measure we developed, it's all written down here. 7 generations of guardianship passed down from father to son. He held out the journal with trembling hands. But now it belongs to all of you. The knowledge, the responsibility, the burden, it's yours to share. Doc Patterson accepted the journal reverently, understanding that he was holding the accumulated wisdom of nearly 2 centuries of guardianship. Jack, what about you? You can't just stop being the guardian after 40 years. Look at me, Doc, Jack said with a wry smile that still held traces of his old humor. I'm 97 years old in a 73-year-old body. The tree took what it needed to save 17 lives, and I gave it willingly. But my time as guardian is ending, just as the tree knew it would. Are you dying? Lucy Henderson asked, with the directness that only children possess. Jack considered the question carefully. I don't know, sweetheart. The tree gave me a choice at the end. Let it take everything, or accept that the guardianship was passing to others. I chose to stay, to help you all understand what you're inheriting. But I'm not the man I was a few hours ago. The community stood in the grove, each person grappling with the magnitude of what had occurred and what lay ahead. They had come seeking a miracle and had received one, but the price was far greater than any of them had imagined. Not just for Jack, who had sacrificed decades of his life, but for all of them. who now carried the weight of protecting something that could change the world if it fell into the wrong hands. As the first stars appeared overhead, filtering through the pine canopy like scattered diamonds, the newly appointed guardians of the heart of the mountain began to understand that their lives had been forever changed by the golden light that had flowed from an ancient tree on a night when love demanded the ultimate sacrifice. 3 days after the Great Healing, as the community had begun to call it, the first outsiders arrived in Pine Hollow. They came not as Jack had expected, not as government officials or medical researchers drawn by reports of miraculous recoveries, but as something far more troubling. Jack sat on his porch in the early morning light, his aged body wrapped in quilts against the mountain chill, when he heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from the south. Through his field glasses, he could see 3 black aircraft flying in formation, their unmarked fuselages gleaming in the sunrise as they circled the valley before landing in the field behind the general store. His hands shook as he lowered the glasses, not from age alone, but from a recognition that chilled him to the bone. He had seen helicopters like these before, 43 years ago, when he was still a young man working the mines. That was when his grandfather had told him the rest of the story, the part that the Cherokee elders had made the first Thornfield Guardians swear never to reveal unless the secret was truly threatened. The tree wasn't just ancient, it was extraterrestrial. Doc Patterson's truck came racing up the mountain road, kicking up clouds of dust as it took the turns faster than safety recommended. The elderly physician climbed out before the engine had fully stopped, his face pale with worry. "Jack, we've got problems," he called out, hurrying to the porch. "Those helicopters landed an hour ago, and the people who got out, they're not government officials or medical researchers. They're something else entirely." "What kind of something else?" Jack asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Military, but not any branch I recognize. No insignia, no identification. They're wearing black uniforms with some kind of technology I've never seen. Communication devices that look more like science fiction than anything our military has." "And Jack," Doc paused, his voice dropping to a whisper, "they knew exactly who to ask for. They went straight to Sarah Morrison and demanded to know where Tommy was healed." Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a secret that had been kept for 7 generations pressing down on him like a physical force. "How much did she tell them?" "Nothing yet. Sarah's smart enough to know something was wrong, and she sent Tommy to stay with his aunt in Billings. But Jack, these people, they're not going to give up easily. They have equipment, scanning devices of some kind. I think they're already searching for the tree." The truth that Jack had hoped never to reveal was pressing against his chest like a caged bird desperate for freedom. His grandfather had made him swear that this knowledge would die with him unless the secret was truly in mortal danger. But with black helicopters circling the valley and armed strangers questioning the townspeople, that moment had clearly arrived. "Doc, there's something I never told you about the tree," Jack said slowly. "Something my grandfather made me promise to keep secret unless there was no other choice." Doc Patterson pulled his chair closer, sensing the gravity of what was about to be revealed. "The Cherokee didn't find the tree growing here naturally," Jack continued. "It wasn't planted by human hands either. According to the tribal histories that my great-great-great-grandfather was told, the tree came from the sky during a night when the stars fell like rain." "What do you mean, came from the sky?" Jack reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather, something he had never shown to another living soul. When he unwrapped it, Doc Patterson saw what looked like a piece of metal, no bigger than a silver dollar, but unlike any metal he had ever seen. It seemed to shift and flow even as he watched, its surface rippling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. "This was found at the base of the tree when my ancestor first arrived here," Jack explained. "The Cherokee medicine man who entrusted him with the secret said it was a piece of the vessel that brought the tree to Earth. The tree isn't just magical. Doc, it's not from this world at all." The implications hit Doc Patterson like a physical blow. "You're saying the tree is alien, from somewhere among the stars?" The Cherokee believed it was a gift from sky spirits, a seed of healing power left behind by travelers from beyond the world. And if I'm right about those helicopters, we're not the only ones who know the truth. As if summoned by Jack's words, the sound of engines echoed up from the valley below. A convoy of black vehicles was making its way up the mountain road, SUVs with tinted windows and unmarked vans that spoke of government resources and official secrecy. "They've been waiting," Jack said with sudden clarity. "All these years, someone has been watching, waiting for the tree to reveal itself. The great healing was too big, too visible. It triggered something, sent out some kind of signal that told them where to look." Doc Patterson stood up, his medical bag clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "Jack, what do we do? How do we protect something like this from people with that kind of resources?" "We don't," Jack said simply. "At least, not by ourselves. The tree chose the whole community as guardians for a reason. It knew this day was coming, knew that the old way of secrecy wasn't going to work anymore." The first of the black SUVs crested the final hill and came into view of Jack's cabin. It moved with purpose, its occupants clearly knowing exactly where they were going. Behind it, two more vehicles followed, and Jack could see armed figures in the passenger seats. "The journal," Jack said urgently. "Did you bring the journal?" Doc Patterson nodded, pulling the leather-bound book from his medical bag. "I've been reading it for 3 days straight. Jack, the things your family recorded, there are other places like this, aren't there? Other trees, other landing sites? 7 that we know of, scattered across the continent. The Cherokee had a network of guardians, families like mine who watched over these gifts from the sky spirits. But we lost contact with the others generations ago. For all I know, we're the last." The lead SUV pulled to a stop in front of Jack's cabin, and 4 figures in black uniforms emerged. They moved with military precision, but their equipment was unlike anything Doc Patterson had seen in 50 years of mountain living. Their communication devices seemed to float beside their heads. Their weapons looked more like energy projectors than conventional firearms. And their leader, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve. "Mr. Thornfield," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "My name is Director Voss. We need to talk." Jack wheeled his chair to the edge of the porch, meeting her gaze steadily despite his aged appearance. "I figured this day would come eventually. Took you longer to find us than I expected." "We've been monitoring unusual energy signatures for decades," Director Voss replied, stepping closer to the porch. "The event 3 days ago registered on our sensors from 3 states away. We know what you're protecting, Mr. Thornfield, and we know it doesn't belong here." "Belongs here more than you do," Jack said mildly. "It's been rooted in this mountain for over 400 years. What's your claim to it?" Director Voss smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Our claim is that Earth's governments have a right to control extraterrestrial artifacts that could pose a threat to national security. Your little healing ceremony may have saved some lives, but it also announced to anyone listening that humanity has access to alien technology. And you think anyone listening is going to be hostile?" "We know they are," Director Voss said, her smile fading. "Mr. Thornfield, you're not the only guardian we've found. In the past 72 hours, we've detected similar energy signatures at 6 other locations across North America. Whatever signal your tree sent out, it's been answered. We have confirmed visual contact with 3 unidentified aircraft, demonstrating flight characteristics far beyond current human technology." Jack felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The tree's great healing hadn't just saved 17 lives. It had sent a signal across the void, calling to whoever had originally planted these seeds of alien power across the earth. And now they were coming back. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Our best estimates suggest they'll reach Earth within the next 48 hours, Director Voss replied. "Which is why we need to secure all 7 trees immediately. We cannot allow alien technology to remain in civilian hands when we're potentially facing first contact with an extraterrestrial species." Doc Patterson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You're talking about cutting down trees that have been healing people for centuries, protecting places that have been sacred to the people who lived here long before your government existed. Doctor, I understand your emotional attachment, Director Voss said, with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. But we're talking about the security of the entire planet. These trees are not just healing tools, they're communication devices, beacons that have been calling their creators back to Earth, and we have no idea what those creators want when they arrive. Jack looked out across the valley where Pine Hollow nestled like a sleeping child, then up at the tree, whose ancient branches swayed in the morning breeze. 17 people had been saved by its power, but in saving them, he might have doomed the entire world to an alien invasion. The weight of 7 generations of guardianship had just become infinitely heavier. Within hours of Director Voss's arrival, Pine Hollow had been transformed into something resembling a military staging ground. Black helicopters circled the valley in regular patrols. Unmarked vehicles filled with sophisticated equipment crowded the streets, and armed personnel in those same mysterious black uniforms had established checkpoints at every road leading into town. Jack sat in his cabin, now under what Director Voss politely called protective custody, watching through his window as teams of technicians set up scanning equipment around the tree's grove. They had cordoned off the entire area with barriers that hummed with an energy he didn't recognize, and their instruments were taking readings of everything from soil composition to electromagnetic emissions. Doc Patterson had been allowed to visit, partly because his medical expertise might be needed, but mostly because Director Voss understood that keeping Jack cooperative required maintaining some connection to the community he had protected for 40 years. "They've quarantined the whole valley," Doc reported, settling into the chair beside Jack's wheelchair. "Nobody in or out without their permission. They're calling it a biohazard containment situation, but the equipment they're using doesn't look like anything designed to handle biological threats." "What about the townspeople? The ones who were healed? Still healthy, but scared. Sarah Morrison is beside herself. They won't let her contact Tommy in Billings, won't even confirm that he's safe. The Henderson family is staying close to home, and little Lucy keeps asking when she can visit you again." Jack nodded grimly. "And the others?" "The people who were at the tree that night. That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Doc said, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the cabin. "Something strange is happening to them, Jack. They're all reporting the same thing. Dreams, visions, glimpses of something they can't quite explain." "What kind of visions?" "Images of the stars, of vast distances traveled, of other worlds where trees like ours grow in groves that stretch beyond the horizon. Pastor Williams described it as seeing the universe through alien eyes. And Jack," Doc paused, his expression troubled, "they're all hearing the same voice, speaking in a language they don't understand, but somehow comprehend anyway." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The trees bonding with them. It's sharing the memories stored in its heartwood, preparing them for what's coming. "What is coming, Jack?" "Director Voss says the aliens will be here within 2 days, but she won't tell us anything about what we should expect." Before Jack could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through the window they could see Director Voss returning from the valley in one of the black SUVs. Her expression even more grim than when she had arrived that morning. She entered the cabin without knocking, her ice-blue eyes scanning the room before settling on Jack. "Mr. Thornfield, we have a problem. A significant problem. More significant than alien visitors?" Jack asked with the dry humor that age and adversity had taught him. "The trees are communicating with each other," Director Voss said, ignoring his tone. "All 7 sites are now active, sending signals that our equipment can detect but not interpret. More troubling, the energy output is increasing exponentially. If this continues, we estimate that within 18 hours, the combined signal will be powerful enough to reach beyond our solar system." Doc Patterson frowned. "I thought you said the aliens were already coming." "They are. But this signal isn't calling them, it's calling something else. Something much farther away, much more powerful. Director Voss moved to the window, looking out at the tree whose ancient branches now glowed faintly even in daylight. "Mr. Thornfield, I need you to tell me everything your family knew about these trees, everything the Cherokee told your ancestor, every legend, every story. Because our linguists have been analyzing the signal patterns, and what they've found suggests this isn't just a homecoming, it's a summoning." Jack exchanged a look with Doc Patterson, then reached for the small metal fragment he had shown his friend earlier. "My grandfather told me that the Cherokee legend spoke of two types of sky spirits. The healers, who planted the trees and left gifts of power for humanity to use wisely, and the harvesters, who would come when the gifts had served their purpose." "Harvesters," Director Voss repeated, her voice flat with dread. "What were they supposed to harvest?" "Everything," Jack said simply. "The trees, the power they contain, and anyone who had been touched by that power." The Cherokee believed that the trees were not permanent gifts, but loans. When the harvesters returned, they would collect not just the trees, but everyone who had been healed by them, everyone who had bonded with the alien consciousness. The implications of Jack's words settled over the room like a burial shroud. Director Voss turned from the window, her military composure cracking slightly. "You're saying that everyone who was healed 3 days ago is now marked for collection?" "According to the legends, yes. And not just them. Anyone who has served as guardian, anyone who has been touched by the tree's power over the generations." Jack looked down at his aged hands, remembering the sensation of the alien consciousness flowing through him. "That would include me, and probably everyone who was in the grove that night." Doc Patterson stood up abruptly, his face pale. "Jack, that's 17 people plus their families who were present. We're talking about nearly half the town, which explains why your government friends here are so interested in controlling the situation," Jack said, turning to Director Voss. "It's not just about alien technology anymore. It's about preventing an entire community from being abducted by extraterrestrial beings." Director Voss nodded grimly. "Our xenobiological specialists believe that the trees serve as biological markers, identifying human subjects who have been successfully exposed to alien genetic material through the healing process. When the harvesters arrive, they'll be able to track anyone who carries that marker. Can the marker be removed?" Doc asked. "Not by any technology we currently possess. The alien genetic material appears to be integrated at the cellular level. Once someone has been healed by the trees, they carry traces of extraterrestrial DNA for the rest of their lives." Jack wheeled his chair closer to the window, looking out at the tree that had been his family's responsibility for 7 generations. Teams of technicians were still working around its base, their instruments registering energy levels that continued to climb with each passing hour. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something my grandfather made me promise never to tell unless the world was ending. The Cherokee didn't just guard the trees, they learned to communicate with them. The original guardians could speak directly to the alien consciousness, could ask it questions and receive answers." Director Voss spun around, her eyes sharp with interest. "You can communicate with the tree?" "I don't know. I never tried. My grandfather said the knowledge was too dangerous, that asking questions might trigger responses we weren't prepared for. But if the harvesters are really coming, if people are going to be taken, you could ask the tree how to stop them," Doc Patterson said. "Understanding immediately, or I could accidentally make things worse," Jack replied. "The Cherokee legends were very clear about this. The trees respond to the intentions of those who communicate with them. If I approach with fear or hostility, the tree might interpret that as a threat and call for protection." Director Voss began pacing the small cabin, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Mr. Thornfield, we have satellite imagery showing 3 large craft entering our solar system. They'll reach Earth's orbit in less than 36 hours. We have teams at all 7 tree sites, but so far, none of our attempts to disrupt the signal have succeeded. The trees seem to be protected by some kind of energy field that deflects our weapons. You tried to destroy them. Jack asked, his voice sharp with alarm. "We tried to disable them." "There's a difference. Not to the trees there isn't," Jack said grimly. "If you've attacked the other sites, you've probably convinced the alien consciousness that humanity is hostile. The trees will be preparing for war now, not just harvest." Through the window, they could see the trees glow, intensifying, its light visible even in the bright afternoon sun. Other members of Director Voss's team were pointing at their instruments, their voices carrying across the clearing in tones of alarm and confusion. "The energy output just doubled," one of the technicians called out. "All instruments are registering critical levels." Director Voss spoke rapidly into her communication device, her words clipped and professional. "All teams report status. Are we seeing similar spikes at the other sites?" The response came back immediately. "Confirmed, Director. All 7 locations showing synchronized energy increases. Signal strength is now detectable on civilian radio equipment across 3 continents." Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his family's guardianship settling on his shoulders one final time. The secret that had been kept for 7 generations was about to be revealed to the entire world. And the choices made in the next few hours would determine whether humanity faced first contact as friends or enemies. "Director Voss," he said quietly, "I think it's time I had a conversation with an old friend." The journey to the tree felt like a funeral procession, with Jack's wheelchair flanked by Director Voss's armed personnel, and followed by Doc Patterson and a team of technicians whose instruments hummed with readings they couldn't fully interpret. The ancient pine now glowed so brightly that it was visible from miles away, its radiance pulsing in rhythm with something that seemed to echo across the vast distances between stars. As they approached the grove, Jack could feel the tree's consciousness pressing against his mind with an urgency he had never experienced before. The alien intelligence within its heartwood was fully awake now, no longer the patient, sleeping presence he had known for 40 years. Something had changed during the government's attempts to disable the other trees, something that had transformed the benevolent guardian into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. "The energy readings are off the charts," one of the technicians reported to Director Voss. "Whatever's happening inside that tree, it's building towards something massive." "How long before the harvesters arrive?" Jack asked, his aged hands gripping the wheels of his chair as they entered the grove. Director Voss checked her communication device. 31 hours, 18 minutes. The lead craft is already decelerating as it approaches Earth's outer atmosphere. The grove itself had been transformed by the government's presence. Barriers ringed the tree at various distances, bristling with sensors and weapons that looked more like science fiction than anything human technology should have been able to produce. Teams of specialists monitored banks of equipment that processed data in ways Jack couldn't begin to understand. But despite all the advanced technology surrounding it, the tree remained the dominant presence in the grove. Its massive trunk rose toward the canopy like a pillar of living light, and the symbols carved into its bark by generations of Thornfield guardians now glowed with the same golden radiance that flowed through its heartwood. "Mr. Thornfield," Director Voss said as they stopped at the edge of the inner circle, "before you attempt communication, you need to understand what we're facing. Our deep space monitoring stations have identified not 3 craft, but 12. The 3 we detected first appear to be scouts. The others are much larger, city-sized vessels that could carry millions of beings." Jack felt his blood turn cold. "Millions? The Cherokee legends you mentioned, did they say anything about how many harvesters would come?" Jack searched his memory for the stories his grandfather had told him during long winter evenings, tales that had seemed like ancient myths until this moment. The legends spoke of the sky spirits returning in numbers like the stars themselves, coming to reclaim their gifts and gather those who had been touched by their power. "And how many people has your tree healed over the past 400 years? The question hit Jack like a physical blow. He had never considered the cumulative impact of 7 generations of guardianship. never calculated how many lives had been touched by the tree's power since his great-great-great-grandfather first became its protector. Hundreds, he said quietly, maybe thousands. Every guardian used the tree's power, and each time we healed someone, their families learned the secret. Some moved away, carried the knowledge to other places. Some had children who inherited traces of the alien genetic. Markers, our xenobiological. Team estimates that approximately 50,000 people worldwide now carry detectable traces of extraterrestrial DNA, Director Voss said grimly. If the harvesters are coming to collect everyone who has been marked, we're not talking about a few dozen abductions. We're talking about mass depopulation. Doc Patterson stepped forward, his face pale with understanding. The healed ones in Pine Hollow, they've been having dreams, visions of other worlds. Are those really memories from the alien consciousness? More than memories, Jack replied, wheeling his chair closer to the tree. The alien intelligence has been preparing them, showing them what to expect when the harvesters arrive. It's been trying to ease their transition from human to whatever they're meant to become. Can you stop it? Director Voss asked. Can you communicate with the tree and convince it to send the harvesters away? Jack reached out and placed his weathered hand against the tree's glowing bark. The moment his skin made contact, the alien consciousness flooded his mind with images and concepts that stretched his human understanding to its limits. He saw vast ships traveling between stars, worlds where forests of trees like this one served as communication networks spanning entire continents, and beings of pure energy who had transcended physical form eons ago. But he also saw something else, fear. The alien consciousness was afraid, not of the approaching harvesters, but of the humans who had attacked the other tree sites. In the tree's perception, humanity had broken the ancient compact by attempting to destroy the gifts that had been left for them. It's not what we thought, Jack said, his voice strained by the effort of processing alien concepts through a human mind. The trees aren't just communication devices or healing tools. They're children. What do you mean, children? Director Voss demanded. The beings who planted them, they're not coming back as harvesters. They're coming back as parents, responding to distress calls from their offspring. When your people attacked the other trees, you triggered a rescue response. The implications of Jack's words spread through the gathered personnel like ripples through still water. The government forces had been preparing to defend Earth against an invasion, but they had actually provoked a protective response from beings who viewed the trees as their children. The tree is trying to tell me something else, Jack continued, his hand still pressed against the glowing bark. The healing power, the genetic markers, they're not just random gifts. They're compatibility tests. The alien consciousness has been identifying humans who can serve as bridge species, beings capable of surviving in both human and alien environments. Bridge species for what purpose? Doc Patterson asked. Jack closed his eyes as more images flowed through his mind, visions of Earth as it might become, with forests of alien trees serving as biological computers that could process information on a planetary scale, and humans who had been enhanced by extraterrestrial DNA, working alongside beings of pure energy to solve problems that spanned solar systems. They're offering us partnership, he said in wonder. Evolution. The chance to become something more than human, to join a galactic community of species who work together across the stars. And the cost? Director Voss asked, her voice sharp with suspicion, leaving Earth behind. The humans who carry the genetic markers would travel with the aliens to other worlds, help them establish new tree networks, serve as ambassadors between species. Jack opened his eyes, meeting Director Voss's gaze. But it would be voluntary. The tree is showing me memories of other worlds where this happened, where some of the native species chose to join the galactic community while others remained on their home planets. What about the ones who stay behind? They keep the trees that are already here. Earth becomes part of the communication network, but humanity retains control of their own world. The aliens would visit periodically, share knowledge and technology, But they wouldn't interfere with human development. Director Voss began pacing around the glowing tree, her mind clearly racing through the political and military implications of Jack's revelations. "Mr. Thornfield, can you ask the tree to delay the arrival of these ships? Give us time to establish proper diplomatic protocols." Jack pressed his hand more firmly against the bark, focusing his thoughts into a question that the alien consciousness might understand. The response came immediately, a flood of concepts that spoke of time flowing differently across interstellar distances, of rescue fleets that had already committed to their trajectory, and of parent beings whose concern for their offspring would not be deterred by human requests for delay. "They can't stop," Jack said grimly. "The ships have been traveling for over 3 days already, accelerating at speeds that humans can barely comprehend." The alien parents received the distress signal from the trees that were attacked, and they've committed everything to reaching Earth as quickly as possible. Then we have less than 30 hours to figure out how to explain to 12 city-sized alien vessels that humanity attacked there. "Children by mistake," Director Voss said, her composure finally cracking. "Mr. Thornfield, can you serve as a translator when they arrive?" Jack looked up at the tree's glowing canopy, feeling the weight of 7 generations of guardianship settling on his shoulders one final time. The secret his family had protected was about to become the most important diplomatic crisis in human history, and he was the only person on Earth who could speak for both species. "I can try," he said quietly. "But Director, there's something else the tree is showing me. Something about what happens if the aliens decide that humanity is too dangerous to be trusted with their gifts." The vision that flowed through Jack's mind from the tree's consciousness was both beautiful and terrifying. He saw worlds where the partnership between aliens and native species had failed, planets stripped bare of their tree networks, their populations left to develop in isolation for millennia while the galactic community moved on to other systems. But he also saw the darker alternative, worlds where species had proven too hostile, too aggressive, and the alien parents had been forced to retrieve not just their children, but all traces of their presence. "What are you seeing?" Director Voss asked urgently, noting the change in Jack's expression. "Sterilization," Jack said quietly. "If the aliens decide that humanity can't be trusted, they don't just take their trees and leave. They remove all genetic material that contains their DNA markers. Every person who has ever been healed, every descendant who carries even traces of the alien enhancement, they're all taken, along with any knowledge of the tree's existence." Doc Patterson stepped closer, his face pale with understanding. "You're talking about selective depopulation. 50,000 people worldwide, vanishing without a trace. And the collective memory of their existence would be erased from everyone who remains," Jack continued, his hand still pressed against the glowing bark. "The aliens have technology that can modify human consciousness on a planetary scale. Earth would be reset to its pre-contact state, as if the trees had never existed." Director Voss stopped pacing, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Jack with laser intensity. "How do we prevent that outcome?" "By convincing them that the attacks on the trees were mistakes, not malicious acts," Jack replied. "The alien consciousness doesn't understand human concepts like government authority or military chain of command. In their culture, anyone who approaches a tree with hostile intent is assumed to speak for their entire species. So when our teams tried to disable the trees, the aliens interpreted it as humanity declaring war on their children," Jack finished. "The tree is showing me the decision-making process happening aboard the approaching ships. The parent beings are debating whether to attempt diplomacy or proceed directly to protective retrieval of their offspring and all associated genetic material." A new voice interrupted their conversation. Sarah Morrison, who had somehow slipped past the security perimeter and was now running toward the grove with little Lucy Henderson at her side. "Mr. Thornfield," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Something's happening to Tommy and the others. They're all having the same vision at the same time, and they're asking for you." Director Voss immediately spoke into her communication device, demanding to know how civilians had breached the secured area. But Jack was more concerned with what Sarah had said about the healed townspeople experiencing synchronized visions. "What kind of vision?" he asked as Sarah and Lucy reached the inner circle. "They're seeing the sky ships," Lucy said with the matter-of-fact clarity that only children possessed. "All of them at the same time. And they can hear voices speaking in that alien language, asking questions about whether humanity wants to join the Star People or stay behind on Earth." Jack felt his blood turn cold. The aliens are conducting their own diplomatic contact, going directly to the people who carry their genetic markers. They're asking the healed ones to vote on behalf of humanity. Vote on what? Director Voss demanded. "Whether to proceed with partnership or sterilization," Jack replied grimly. "In the alien culture, decisions are made by consensus among all affected parties. Since humans with the genetic markers represent the bridge species, their collective decision will determine Earth's fate." Sarah Morrison grabbed Jack's arm, her mother's instincts overriding any concern for alien diplomacy. "My Tommy is 17 years old. You're saying he's being asked to help decide the future of the human race?" "All of them are," Jack said gently. "Every person who was healed by the trees, everyone who carries the genetic markers, they're all receiving the same vision, the same request for consensus." Lucy Henderson tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Grandpa Jack, Mary says the Star People are showing her pictures of other worlds where kids like us get to fly between the stars and talk to beings made of light. But she's scared because it means leaving Mama and Daddy behind." The innocence of the child's words cut through the complexity of the situation like a knife. At its heart, this wasn't about government, policy, or military strategy. It was about families being asked to choose between staying together on Earth or accepting an opportunity that would separate them forever. "How long do they have to decide?" Doc Patterson asked. Jack pressed his hand more firmly against the tree's bark, seeking answers from the alien consciousness. "The parent ships will reach Earth's orbit in 14 hours. The consensus voting will continue until then, with the final decision transmitted to the ships as they arrive. And if the vote is for sterilization, then the ships will deploy their memory modification technology immediately upon arrival. 50,000 people will vanish, and the remaining human population will have no memory that they ever existed. Earth will be quarantined from galactic contact for the next several thousand years." Director Voss began barking orders into her communication device, calling for immediate contact with world leaders and demanding that all 7 tree sites be linked into a global communication network. But Jack wasn't listening to her anymore. The tree's consciousness was showing him something else, a third option that the aliens hadn't offered to the healed humans, but which might be available if requested by someone who understood the full situation. "There's another choice," he said suddenly, causing everyone to fall silent. "The tree is showing me memories of a few worlds where a different arrangement was made. Instead of some humans leaving while others stayed behind, the entire species was given time to develop, centuries or millennia, with the trees serving as teachers and guides." "What kind of time?" Sarah asked. "Gradual integration. The trees would remain on Earth, continuing to heal and teach, but spreading their influence more slowly. Over generations, more humans would develop compatibility with the alien genetic material. Eventually, humanity would become a bridge species naturally, without anyone having to leave their families behind." "How long would that take?" Director Voss asked. 50 to 100 generations, Jack replied. "Maybe longer. It would mean accepting alien guidance and influence over human development, but it would keep families together and allow Earth to remain humanity's home." Lucy Henderson looked up at the glowing tree with wonder in her young eyes. "So, instead of some people going to the stars right now, everyone could go to the stars eventually?" "Something like that, sweetheart," Jack said gently. "But would the aliens accept such an arrangement?" Doc Patterson asked. "Especially after their children were attacked?" Jack closed his eyes and focused all his remaining strength on communicating with the alien consciousness, formulating a concept that bridged human and alien understanding. He projected images of families staying together, of gradual learning and growth, of humanity eventually joining the galactic community as equals rather than junior partners. The response came as a flood of complex emotions, surprise that a human had conceived of this option, consideration of its viability, and something that might have been hope. "They're willing to consider it," Jack said, his voice weak from the effort of sustaining such deep communication. "But only if the proposal comes from someone who truly understands the responsibility involved. Someone who can speak for both humanity and the trees. The vote among the healed ones. Can it be modified to include this third option?" Director Voss asked. "Yes, but it would require a guardian to present the alternative directly to the alien consciousness and accept responsibility for its implementation," Jack replied. "Someone would have to bond permanently with the tree network, becoming a bridge between human and alien understanding for as long as the arrangement lasts." The implications of what he was suggesting settled over the grove like a heavy blanket. Jack was offering to sacrifice his remaining humanity to serve as a permanent translator and mediator between species, ensuring that the gradual integration proceeded peacefully over the coming centuries. "Jack," Doc Patterson said quietly, "that's not just giving up your life. That's giving up your species." "Maybe," Jack replied, looking around at the faces of the people he had protected for 40 years. "But it's also the only way to keep families together and give humanity a chance to grow into something greater." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Pine Hollow, Jack Thornfield prepared to make the final sacrifice that 7 generations of guardianship had been leading toward. 5 years had passed since the night that changed everything, and Pine Hollow had found a new rhythm in the shadow of the tree that now pulsed gently with starlight, even during the day. Jack sat in his specially designed chair, no longer quite human, no longer entirely alien, but something new that bridged both worlds. Watching the morning sun rise over the valley he had protected for nearly half a century, his transformation had been gradual and profound. The alien consciousness no longer spoke to him through painful visions, but lived alongside his human thoughts in peaceful symbiosis. His aged body had been restored to something approaching his prime, though his eyes now held depths that reflected the vast distances between stars, and his hands could channel healing power with a touch. The integration had proceeded exactly as he had hoped. Children born in Pine Hollow now grew up learning about both human history and galactic civilization. The tree served as their teacher, sharing knowledge through dreams and gentle mental contact that never overwhelmed their developing minds. Some chose to embrace the alien enhancements as they reached adulthood, while others remained fully human, both paths equally valued by the community. Lucy Henderson, now 15 and one of the tree's most promising students, climbed the path to Jack's Grove with the easy confidence of someone who had never known a world where such wonders were secret. She carried a tablet that displayed messages from the other 6 tree sites around the world, where similar communities had developed their own unique approaches to human-alien integration. "Morning, Grandpa Jack," she called out, using the old nickname that had somehow become his official title in the new order. "Dr. Patterson wants to know if you can spare some time today for the documentary crew." Jack smiled, remembering when such a request would have filled him with dread. Now, transparency was essential to the integration process. The world needed to understand what was happening in places like Pine Hollow, needed to see that partnership with the galactic community was possible without surrendering human identity. "What do they want to know about?" he asked, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there when he was fully human. "The healing protocols, mostly. There's a new illness spreading through Central America, something the regular doctors can't treat. The World Health Organization wants to establish treatment protocols based on what we've learned here." Jack nodded, understanding the careful balance involved in such decisions. The trees could heal any ailment, But each healing created new members of the bridge species, individuals who would carry alien genetic markers for the rest of their lives. The global community had learned to reserve such treatments for truly desperate cases, ensuring that the integration proceeded at a sustainable pace. "Tell Doc Patterson I'll meet with them this afternoon," Jack said. "But remind them that healing decisions belong to the patients and their families, not to governments or organizations." Lucy made a note on her tablet, then looked up at the tree whose canopy now hosted a small community of dwellings built by those who had chosen deeper integration with the alien consciousness. Sarah Morrison lived there now, along with Tommy, who had become one of the tree's most dedicated caretakers. They maintained the physical structure while Jack handled the translation and diplomatic duties. "There's something else," Lucy said, her expression growing serious. "The starships are coming back, not the parent ships, different ones. The tree says they're envoys from the Galactic Council, coming to evaluate how the integration is progressing." Jack felt a flutter of the old anxiety, then let it pass through him without resistance. He was no longer the solitary guardian bearing impossible burdens, but part of a community that shared both the responsibilities and the rewards of bridging two civilizations. "When will they arrive?" 3 days. "But Grandpa Jack, the tree says they're bringing representatives from other bridge species, beings like us from worlds where the integration was successful. We'll get to meet people who started this journey centuries ago and see what we might become." The wonder in Lucy's voice reminded Jack of why he had made his choice 5 years ago. This young woman would grow up in a universe full of possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet she would do so without losing her connection to the mountain community that had shaped her. Doc Patterson emerged from the path leading up from the valley, moving with the spry energy of someone whose life had been extended by periodic healing sessions with the tree. At 87, he looked barely 60, and his mind remained as sharp as it had been in his prime. "Jack, we've got visitors," he announced, gesturing toward a small group approaching through the trees. The visitors turned out to be the Henderson family, Pete, his wife Maria, and their youngest daughter who had been born 3 years after the Great Healing. Little Emma Henderson had been the first child born in Pine Hollow who carried natural alien genetic markers, inherited from her sister, Mary's transformation. She was a cheerful 4-year-old who could communicate telepathically with the tree and occasionally floated small objects through the air when she was particularly excited. "Uncle Jack," Emma called out, running toward his chair with her arms outstretched. "The tree told me the star people are coming to visit. Can I meet them?" Jack caught the child in a gentle embrace, marveling, as always, at the casual way she blended human emotion with alien abilities. "I think they'd very much like to meet you too, little one. You're probably closer to what they're hoping humanity will become than any of us." Pete Henderson shook Jack's hand with the firm grip of a man who had found peace with the extraordinary path his family had chosen. "Jack, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. 5 years ago, when you offered to serve as the bridge, I thought we were losing you. But look at what you've become, what we've all become." Jack looked around the grove, taking in the sight of the tree's glowing canopy, the small community that had grown up in its branches, and the faces of people who had learned to live between worlds without losing sight of their humanity. "This is what guardianship really means," he said quietly. "Not keeping secrets or hiding power, but helping others find their own path to wonder." As the sun climbed higher over Pine Hollow, Jack Thornfield, guardian, translator, and bridge between worlds, settled back in his chair to watch another day unfold in the community that had learned to embrace the extraordinary. In 3 days, when the starships arrived, they would find not a world struggling with alien contact, but a species beginning to discover its place in the vast community of minds that spanned the galaxy. The tree pulsed gently in the morning light, its ancient consciousness content in the knowledge that the long wait was finally over. The seeds planted 400 years ago had bloomed into something beautiful, and the harvest would be measured not in conquest or subjugation, but in the gradual transformation of an entire world into something greater than the sum of its parts. In Pine Hollow, the future had found its roots, and those roots ran deeper than anyone had ever dared to dream.